Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of First and Stars Podcast third season. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. This is an amazing episode because Philip Tarl Denson boards the mothership to discuss Future Tales, now on Amazon. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Denson. Thank you for Traversing the Stars Podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's really my pleasure. So I always start off with a question of inspiration to inspire your love for comics and who are your earliest influences.
Earliest. Okay, that means I have to be young. You know what? My earliest influences in the comic book world would be Asterix comics and Tintin comics because they
Okay.
were the one my parents gave us, and really got me into the whole sequential art, like panels, and really made me realize that because I would also draw a lot and I still love drawing. But I kind of realized that books by themselves are amazing and you can imagine it, but when you can have the artwork right in front of you and you can and go along with it, yeah, that's sort of the thing that really opened up my eyes for storytelling. But from since then it evolved into a lot of sci-fi reading. Philip K. Dick is an author that I really loved and read a lot of as a younger man. Heinlein, but in the comic book world, it was some of the classics, Marvel and DC, but then Image Comics. But more and more, it's become just independent comics because that's to me where the most original ideas are coming from.
Mm. And for your original idea, you're now the writer of a graphic novel called Future Tales, which is on Amazon. So if you're listening, go to Amazon, pick up the graphic novel. So what inspired the creation of Future Tales, and what did you feel the idea was ready to proceed with? Because as a writer myself, we all know we have ideas, and they percolate in your head for a long time, but it takes a little extra to actually put the work in to actually sit down and actually write it. So when did you feel it's time?
That's a really interesting point because I was going to say, I'm a professional writer. I'm always, but you're absolutely right because I came up with this idea years ago, and I'm talking like 15, 20 years ago, because I saw in fairy tales, classic fairy tales, this sort of shared universe. They're often kids lost in the woods, or there's a big bad wolf with the three little pigs and Red Riding Hood, and in my mind, I connected them, and I was like, okay, that's the same big bad wolf, or that's the same woods, and obviously the Brothers Grimm unified some of these fairy tales as well, although there were often tales that were told and retold in many different ways. So I almost instantly went like, oh, well, that's the whole point of fairy tales. You tell them to fit your generation or your culture, and they've gone all over the world. So I was like, oh, what about we just jump a little bit ahead in time and enjoy all the stuff that I love, like references to things like Battle Angel Alita and Ghost in the Shell and anime that I watched as a kid, but also Transformers and those Saturday morning cartoons that I just loved, and mutants and things like that. So I just kind of combined them, and although this book is seven chapters plus an eighth chapter, but seven chapters which are all focused on a fairy tale, classic fairy tale, retold in this post-apocalyptic cyberpunk world. The thing that really drew me into it was that this is a shared universe, and these characters, yeah, they can tell their story. We can tell the Goldilocks story, but her what she does in that story influences what happens in the next chapter, and she shows up in another chapter. Red, the Little Red Riding Hood character, who's sort of our lead, she rocks up in a few of the different chapters until at the end they all join together to fight the big bad wolf.
So, and for those listeners who are like, well, that's so weird to think of fairy tales in adult books. The original Grimm fairy tales were pretty harsh. I mean, from our kid standards, those were some
Yeah.
pretty harsh books.
Oh yeah, they get into the violence and because I mean, when they were first told, which was generally verbal, it was quite a violent world. People would die. I think the average life was under 40. Um, Kids were dying all the time. That if you made it to adulthood, then you're like one of the few. It's a quite a violent world, and it was mainly told to scare kids from wandering away or from being aware of this world. And we put a bit of magic and other sprinkled things over the top, but they're all allegories for other things and often fear-based. And I like to kind of flip that a little bit. So, like, the old lady who's lives down the street, we've sort of been taught through fairy tales to be scared of her. But just because someone's different or weird doesn't necessarily, in fact, it often means that they're ostracized and there's a lot more empathy and kindness there. So we get the reason why we want to make sure that the kids were safe, but they were violent. And some of the retellings were violent. I read this was years ago. I read a version of Sleeping Beauty by Neil Gaiman, which was
Yeah.
pretty dark in a lot of ways. So even modern retellings can go there as well.
And as you mentioned about fairy tales, that all fairy tales had a lesson, a message of the story, something, a takeaway that you had to experience. Um, whether, I mean, depending on how quaint it was. I mean, even the Three Little Bears is kind of like mind your own fucking business. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of what it is. Like stay out of someone's business. Go, I'm sure there's more deep levels than that, but that's always what that got me when I was like, just get the fuck away, mind your own business.
Eat other people's porridge, don't sleep in their beds, or you'll be eaten.
Right. Um, so as someone who's writing a fairy tale, cyberpunk, apocalyptic story, what is the takeaway, the moral takeaway from that?
Oh, see, this is interesting because I like to get deep into my themes, but I also just like, especially in the comics world, just like to have fun. Let's make sure
Yeah,
this is a world where we can just enjoy, that escapist sort of element of this of storytelling, which I really often don't necessarily get in my day job, which as a screenwriter, sometimes we're dealing with some pretty serious stuff. So it's fun just to get into it. But the ultimate thing, moral, and not to give away the story, but it's about banding together and our differences actually help us rather than make us that different. We do have our big bad in this world is the wolf, which is not an entity, but it's a group. It stands for the World Order Liberation Force. And you'll start to see how it all connects in all the different fairy tales because they live in a floating city or sky city as we call it, and it floats over this ruined city which they have destroyed. And the survivors live in three underground bunkers like the Three Little Pigs, but one is getting destroyed and they keep running away. And but we kick this all off with Little Red Riding Hood, who she's a rider. She comes up to the surface to deliver messages from one to the other. Just like in the story, she's taking something to Grandma's house and has a run-in with the wolf soldiers. But all those things can connect because Jack and the Beanstalk, he can go up to the floating city and get his, the golden egg, or the allegory of that. There's ways they can all connect. And finally, these seven different heroes join together for the fun. It's almost like the Avengers. They all join together to do an Avengers style team up to fight against the big bad. So yeah, it's about unity, really.
and I mean, just from your characters, you have Locke, which I assume is Goldilocks.
Yeah,
We have Jack. We got the twins, which is Hansel and Gretel, if I'm looking at
Matthew.
that correctly.
Yep,
We have, it looks like it's a character called Beauty, which I assume is Sleeping Beauty. I'm
that's
correct with
correct.
that as well. And like I said, we have a bunch of others there as the character called Zell and Ella as well is in there. So when you have dealing with all these different fairy tale characters and you have all these different stories, and also you have these different artists as well.
Mm.
Is it difficult to keep a narrative through line through all these different characters, through all these different chapters, and make it feel, as you get to the last chapter, that all belong together to begin with?
Well, not necessarily. I'm a very much about planning. So, although we wrote the first chapter a while ago and did the art for that with Annika P. Putri, who's an amazing artist, originally from Indonesia, but here in Australia, that one was kind of contained to be the Little Red Riding Hood story. But from when I first devised this concept, it was always the first chapter that was going to link into the others. I just didn't know what order they were going to be in.
Hmm.
So when I finally sat down and ordered them, you're coming from a base of very classic storytelling that most people know the basic idea of Sleeping Beauty or the basic idea of Rapunzel. And it's about lining them up with what the story I wanted to tell, which was connecting how we connected them all, and hopefully organically, because I didn't want to try to force it too much. I know there was one or two things I'm like, oh, this is sort of, well, there's other ones that were just perfect, but I was like, oh, this works perfectly for what I'm trying to do in this world. So I kind of let it grow and tell itself, and making sure the chapters could stand alone, because originally it was devised to be an anthology that we were doing through Wild North Comics, and people could will just get the 10 pages of that chapter, and it could be its own little thing, and then they move on to a bunch of other different ones. Whereas collecting them all together, the whole piece was to be, there's this one through line, there's one story that, in one of them, something happens which leads to the invasion that happens in the next one, which leads to, the rescue attempt, or running through the sewer tunnels and getting found by these other, like, I hope I'm not giving too much away, but um, that's the idea to let it kind of flow into normally. But the more difficult thing was making sure the artists, I find a different artist from around the world, because fairy tales are universal.
Mm.
And it was all about making sure that they were comfortable enough to bring their own skill, but they're also their own culture into the work. So I think you brought up Sleeping Beauty. That was done by a Nigerian artist, and I was like, hey, if you want, make her Nigerian. Same with our, the two kids, Hansel and Gretel, Filipino artists work on that. And because that one's more perspectively from kids, I said, hey, feel free to go a bit more cartoony and even Disney, because then we have this different art style in each chapter. But because the character designs can link, and you can see the characters show up from time to time in different chapters, you actually see different versions or an artist's take on that, which I don't know about you, but I really like seeing like a variant cover, or different artists take on a classic on a classic character that I've loved. So I kind of wanted to hint towards that on this one.
And it's also educational. There's a part in there about, was it a silver ball that's used for in the sewers to clean? I
Yeah,
didn't know that was a thing. That's actually a thing.
yeah. So I mean, it's funny because that was an early thing I had for Cinderella, when I wanted her to, she had to get to the ball, because obviously in the Cinderella story she's going to the ball to meet the prince or something. And in our one, she's escaping a city that's being attacked. But the ball is, I don't know if it's in the US, but I know in Europe they've used these giant balls to clean the sewers back in the day, and they'll these. I guess they would just roll them through, but these we're talking pretty big.
Seriously?
Um, yeah, and I think I discovered that years ago, and I
Where
just
would
kind
that
of
information even
connected the
come
two.
from? I'm wondering, where do you look for, like, one day you're just looking up big silver balls and that's what popped up?
Like, all right, here we go. But yeah, so that kind of worked well for that one. And there's some subtleties within the chapters where you're like, you might not get. I mean, another example would be in the Cinderella one. She's escaping, and how she escapes is behind a pumpkin cart. She uses that to get her from point A to point B, which is kind of an allusion to the Disney Cinderella, where she changes a pumpkin into a
Mm.
cart to get to the ball. And that's because the survivors living underground, they can't grow many things, but one of the things they can grow is pumpkins and mushrooms and things like that. So they'll have a cart full of pumpkins. So, I mean, just little things that as a writer, I get excited about, but most people don't care.
You know what? As a writer, sometimes you just gotta do the thing that makes you chuckle. You're just like, it's then whether they get it or not. If you read it and it makes you laugh, that's for
Yeah,
us
exactly.
too. I will say, I missed the Ella. I was like, Cinderella. Now that you mentioned, you said, I was like, duh.
Yeah,
How
she's
did I
got the
miss? How
metal
did that one
leg.
slide by?
I tried to get more and more obscure as we went, because the penultimate chapter is called Zell, and it's about one. Not to give too much away of the story, but she lives up um, in the floating city with the wolf. She's one of the scientists, but she starts to realize and to feel sympathy and empathy for the survivors, and she lets down let's say an elevator to allow them access. And that one probably went furthest away from the traditional story, because it's Rapunzel letting down her hair to allow
Oh,
the prince to
gotcha. All
climb
right.
up.
I missed
But
that one.
that's the one where I've had a few people read and they go, ah, Little Red Riding Hood 100%. We get it. Goldilocks, yep, and the bears. And then they're like, "Who's Zell?" And I'm like, "Oh, should I explain it, or should they just read it and enjoy it? Get to the final chapter."
But I mean, it's a lot of fun. I think the other part is that it's cyberpunk. Now, something that cyberpunk has certain kind of tropes it needs to have to be constitute cyberpunk. So
Mm.
when you're writing it, what are you how or at least what does cyberpunk mean to you? And how did you what kind of tropes did you make sure we're in there so it can be concluded as a cyberpunk story?
So yeah, to make it cyberpunk for me, firstly, it has to be futuristic. There's some element of the future. There needs to be some sort of cybernetic element, and that could just be a robot arm or something like that. And I know not all cyberpunk follows that, but for me, I feel like there needs to be some sort of, not fully transhuman, but people who have the ability to play with elements.
Mm.
Um, for example, Red in this, she has a thing called a hood, which stands for the holographic ordnance object device, which allows her to project holograms to sneak through the woods, which is the surface, the bombed out city. Um, so there's that, but there's also like a robot arm here or there. Cinderella, she's got a robot leg or a robotic leg or cybernetic leg. Thus the leaving the leg behind is like leaving her shoe behind in the story. So there's that element, and there's also a tonal element to it. And although this comic is an all ages comic, there's nothing too untoward. We didn't, even though some of the artists wanted to go a little bit more sexier with some of the characters who are great characters for that, especially Reg. You could draw her more like that. I wanted to keep it a little bit more like she's a badass. She's or badass, as you guys say. She is tough. She's military. She has this one line to Lox at one point where Lox goes up to her and says, "Oh, I want to be like you when I grow up." And she just says, "If you grow up." And I was like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." She's just tough, battle worn kind of warrior. So I didn't want to make her, wearing lipstick and all pouty or something. So she's tough. I had to go there, which allowed us also to be like, yeah, this is an all age comic, but there's still the tone of like oppression or something like that, which I think is pretty heavy in a lot of cyberpunk, whether it's the government or corporations, things like that. And but the interesting thing about this one is it if you go through the timeline, it's a cyberpunk world that then became a post-apocalyptic world. So often in post-apocalyptic, we think of our world as it is now, and then we jump ahead to the apocalypse. Whereas this one is our world as it is in 40, 50 years, where there is cybernetic enhancements and stuff. And then there's a post-apocalyptic when the wolf soldiers come and take over. So it was kind of combining the two.
So, and I think that the hard thing I think to do with a story like this, in my opinion, as not the writer, but I think it's hard, probably or must be, is that you have to balance a lot of world building, and you can't get lost within the world building. I think sometimes, um, I'm sure like Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien gets accused of getting lost within the world building in some chapters where he's talking about the trees and everything else, and it's like, all right, but the story, guy, the story
Yeah.
when you're developing future tales and you got to build a lot of world building because not only exists the future, but it's the future that has actually now experienced an even further apocalypse. How hard was it not to get lost in the world building? How did you pick and choose which parts of the world you did want to tell us about, and how much did you just kind of have to let kind of like us just build for ourselves and kind of make connect the dots for?
I guess that's sort of one of the benefits of a comic or a graphic novel is you don't have the freedom to just spend 3 pages talking about trees or the describing which you know what I didn't hate as a younger man when I was reading, but now, especially being a screenwriter, it's all about efficiency of your writing. And in the comic, and you'll even notice, I don't know if this has been up in too many reviews, but I've had some feedback and some reviews of this, which talks about how it is a quick read. It's 100 pages, but it's a quick read because I personally, although I love stuff like, From Hell or V for Vendetta, things like that, there's often a lot of text on a page. and it can get a bit sluggish. Like I feel like okay, I'm ready, but I'm fully in there. Whereas I like letting the visuals tell the story, and it's the same with my screenwriting. I like visual storytelling, and you just do a background of a bombed out city, and it tells you half the stuff. You show a floating battle city, it tells you a lot without having to tell you a lot. I love world building. There's so much more we wanted to explore with this, and there's so many more characters. There's like a whole thing I wanted to weave in, which I couldn't in this one, which was about the Pied Piper and our version of that and what that would have meant. But maybe that's for volume two. So we'll really well, I was very aware of the world building, but also letting it just be its thing because it's all about story for me and character and get that journey. And also, we only had 10 pages per chapter. So I needed to, well, some of them I wiggled a little bit, or an artist will say, oh, this page, could I split it into two and just let them do their thing? Because that's the other thing, the artist brings so much. I might direct them a little bit and go, oh, this arm needs to look more janky and put together, not so clean. Because that's the other thing. I really love the lived-in world where it's things are not shiny, but dirty and thrown together. And we talked about cyberpunk and I love other punks like steampunk and biopunk and whatever. And I personally have my own aesthetic for another project of mine, which I'm calling junk punk, because it's just like things thrown together and I always bring an element of that into these kind of stories too, just because I like that aesthetic.
Mm. And I think I agree. I did when I was reading Future Tales. It is such a fast, swift read, and as you mentioned, there are stuff like V for Vendetta, Samuel's, very talky books. But I do love also like the Usagi Yojimbo, which you just can sit and just read in 10 minutes. It's this
Absolutely.
fast-paced, swift read,
Mm.
it's something to very enjoyable too about that. Nice, enjoyable. I don't have to like invest the next hour of my life reading this book. It's what I'm saying. It's just boom, and you can get all at once. And I think that's what makes Future Tales move very quickly. It's sort of
Yeah,
like it's like a really fast action movie. That's like 90 minutes. Boom, it gets done.
yeah.
You just enjoy it.
That's, I think that's what Netflix likes. They're like, okay, people are watching these 90-minute films. We want more of them. Just get them in. But yeah, I hope that it does make people think too. There's an element of there's this story going on that you could just read on the surface, but the fact that it's based on the different fairy tales, and part of the fun of this as a reader, but also as a writer, is what parts link to the classic fairy tales. Where are the little nods and the Easter eggs and even I alluded to the meta story, which is not its own chapter, but is the three little pigs, the three underground cities. And they're all run by ex-cops. So I mean, I'm not to I mean, I love my cop friends. I won't call them pigs, but that's the analogy there. So there's a lot of different layers where people could dig in deeper. But it's really just to whet the appetite, get you into this world, introduce these characters, do justice to their story, but also tell a one bigger story too.
Because it kind of, you can correct me if this is totally off base, but this is what I was thinking. Future Tales kind of reads to me almost like a zero issue. Like, because it feels like every character has their, oh, like, Red has tons of backstory, and you
Yeah.
don't know it, but you feel it. Like, Jack has a
Mm,
lot of backstory. You don't know what it is, but you feel that that it's there. Because they feel tangible enough that you assume there's a much more going on behind that we aren't caught up on. But I feel like not only is there that much information, but there should be. So
mm,
I mean, I'm just I don't know if you're trying to see what I'm getting at, but it kind of feels like this is the beginning of an offshoot of a DC universe of feature tale
mm.
stories. But I'm just throwing that out there.
I remember when Image first launched and they had their Youngblood
Yeah.
and then that went off to become Wildstorm. I think they had their
Um.
own label.
Wildstorm and Youngblood or separate. It was Youngblood became Bloodstrike and Brigade. I used to buy all the comic books, and then
Yeah.
Youngblood Strike File, and then New Men, and then about 100 other Supreme and a bunch of others.
Yeah,
I used to
and
buy them
and
all.
then there's also Top Cow and a few other like offshoots from those creators who started Image. In one sense, with Future Tales, we could totally do a team up, like a team book, and continue this team together and how they live in this world, um, especially with the wolf soldiers, and that it could be like that. But one thing I love to do is start late and get out early, that kind of thing. And there's a screenwriting thing about that. So, like, we meet Jack, for example, and he's selling batteries or batteries um, and he runs out. This is underground, and he sneaks out as a scavenger to scavenge things, which you're not allowed to do because it might draw the wolf soldiers to you. And that's when he sees this opportunity to go up into the floating city. So in a one page, basically, we can see a character who, to me, is interesting. I like this guy. The cover art for the Jack one is just this guy sitting on the top of a ruined building, just relaxing, looking up, and there's the big floating city in the background. And just that image sat with me in my mind for maybe 15 years. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. And we ended up getting the artist who did it, nailed it. He was amazing from Morocco. So I was like, there's certain things where an image or just a page for a character can give you the illusion of such a bigger background. And to me, that's one of the secrets in writing is if you can get us to connect to a character and want to know more, but sort of feel like we know them, then you've got the audience. You're ready to take them in whatever direction. And in this case, I hope I did that for a few different characters. But yeah, there's a lot more story to tell. And I could do like backstories and origin stories for each of these characters too. Maybe not Locks because she's so young, but even her, she's like a little street urchin. She's had a lot of run-ins throughout her life, her short life. So yeah, I mean, I like what you're putting down, and we'll see what we do and where we go with this story.
Now, for those of us who's wondering about wolf, I'm looking at it's not a wolf. It's basically a world conquering um,
Mm.
army. So far as wolf goes, what is the central goal of wolf? If you would ask wolf, the people, those in charge, what is their end game and why are they the heroes of their story? What would be their hero story?
What a great, you must be a writer. You're such a good, that's a good question because I also do that. Whenever I have a bad guy, I often off in my screenwriting, don't normally have an antagonist or personified antagonist. I like internal struggles. I like people who are, fighting against other things. But when I do, they need to be the coolest character or the deepest character or the one you actually feel and empathize for. Something like this, at the start, they were just a stand-in for the Empire or, stormtroopers, the wolf soldiers kind of have that vibe, although we designed them in a very different way. They've got like these radar ears and these gas masks that gives them a bit of a wolf vibe as well, but they're soldiers. However, if you dig a little bit deeper, and we did do a blurb which didn't make it to the graphic novel, which talks about so the name Wolf stands for World Order Liberation Force. So they started with a positive. They wanted to liberate the world from what they believed was this one world order that was trying to control everyone. We're digging deep now because I haven't told anyone this. Um, but that's how they began. But when there is anyone trying to force one thing, there's going to be a resistance. And then sometimes with cognitive dissonance, we get down a road and we can't turn back, and you start going too aggressive, you cross the line. So this is obviously like years and years later. But we do get a hint of it early when we get this flashback in Sleeping Beauty's story and her connection. She's actually the key to their happily ever after. And her connection and her parents' connection, she's been asleep in a cryopod or stasis for 100 years. So we actually get a hint to what the wolf soldiers were at the start and how they were trying to build technology to help the world. And then they harness that technology to have their own authoritarian rule over the world. So yeah, it's interesting that we don't get too much into the leadership of there. There is one character who rocks up in the Cinderella story, and he becomes the one that we can see, but he is just like a general in the army, or even lower down. He's not even the big bad. So that's another thing we can explore in future stories.
So to quote a great film, The Dark Knight, you either die the
Mm.
hero or you live long enough to become the villain. Is that kind of the situation here?
Absolutely. And I think that happens a lot. I think whether it's in politics, and let's not get political, but whether it's in politics or whenever there's power involved as well, if you think you know better for someone else, that can get in the way of actual connection and empathy for our fellow humans or life or animals or whatever. And even the fact that they started using genetically modified humans and animal hybrids, which show up a little bit here and there. Like there's a hint in, I don't know if you saw, but there's a hint in the Jack story when he goes up, he sees this shadowy figure inside a big tube. And that's actually a hint to the Little Mermaid, whose story might pop up later. And the bears, they're called, that stands for the bioengineered augmented resources, which the wolf soldiers created. These cybernetically enhanced plus genetically enhanced uh, soldiers, which in our story is like ran away from the wolf soldiers and just live by themselves. They kind of create their own little found family, which is like the mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear. That's just because they're different sizes. There's a lot more underneath the surface to explore with that. But I also just like getting a hint. And just quickly, I'll tell you the example. I remember as a very young man watching A New Hope, Star Wars A New Hope the first time, and there's a throwaway line that talks about the Clone Wars. Oh, yeah, my father fought in the Clone Wars or something like that, and never talked about it again. And in my head, I was like, "Whoa, what? That's so. What is that? What's a Clone War? I want to know about that." And I kind of love that, where as an audience member, I could be engaged on the story world building, where it's not what the story's about, but I can create this new version of it in my head, or I can explore and imagine what it could be. And I wanted to tap into that a little bit with Future Tales.
I love that. And then you mentioned about Clone Wars. It's what does Lucas call it? It's sort of a what do you call it? Used future. The idea that a future that already has a history to it. And
Right. I
most
love that.
at the time, all sci-fi was made to look fancy, new, and everything looked like that was suddenly somehow it just grew up in the future. But Star Wars, the
Mm,
first one, kind of said, no, this used future. This is a bit of history long before this film came in. Everything looks like it's been around for thousands of years. I like the idea
yeah.
that in your book is what that kind of like history exists, even though it's the future, which
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the
it's fairly
history is what
obvious.
led.
Right. I mean, it's like
And
when you think of it, it's like, yeah, the future has to have a past, but most films just assume kind of had to like just spring out of nowhere. You know, hey, look, it's the future.
yeah, oh, it's our past, and then this is that one little change. But yeah, if you're going to jump anywhere more than 50 years, there's got to be, I mean, think of the last 50 years, how much things have happened and how the world has changed. So yeah, I love that. And in fact, I vaguely remember that being used, but I'm going to use that more. I used future. That's a good word.
Oh, thank you. Well, Lucas came up with it, according to I just like to repeat it. Anyways, assuming I got it correct. Anyways, so Future Tales is a let's say it's a 100-page graphic novel. It's available on Amazon. So so that's the best place for our listeners to grab the graphic novel?
Yeah, if you're in North America, jump on Amazon. We've made it pretty not that expensive, so you can jump on it. I think there's free shipping as well. So if you're not in North America, then jump onto the website wildnorthcomics.com/future tales, but also check out the other comics there. Just reach out to us. We actually Outlaw Comics is on Facebook, Wild North Comics is on Facebook. Also the one on Amazon, it doesn't show, but we've got this gold foil title. So yeah, it actually gives that little bit of extra zhuzh to it, which I really like. So yeah, but Amazon would be the place to go, probably the best or easiest version to get.
All right, so for our listeners, please go to Amazon right now, and we'll put the link in our notes. So check our notes too. We'll have the link to the Amazon page. Mr. Denson, it was an absolute pleasure talking with you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Burn Stars Podcast. Please like and subscribe. Turn for the next episode, which is Zoo Garcia boards the mothership to discuss the Nightmare on Elm Street. Until next voyage, travel on.